So thanks so much for joining us today. My name's Andrew Pinto, and I'm a physician and scientist at the University of Toronto. I direct a research team called the Upstream Lab, and we're really delighted to have another episode of our speaker series, this time focusing on movements to solve the housing crisis and really examining the role of researchers, academics, and public policy professionals. Just to say a little bit about the Upstream Lab, we're a nonprofit research team that's based at the Centre for Urban Health Solutions in Toronto. We're focused on improving health through action around the social determinants of health, but also looking at new areas like data science and also using methods like clinical trials as well to evaluate interventions. And where we're located in Toronto is the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, the Mississaugas of the Credit, and many Indigenous communities from across Turtle Island. And of course, Toronto is home to tens of thousands of Indigenous individuals. Part of our work is thinking about our work in the relation to a movement to decolonize our spaces and decolonize our work, as well as thinking about the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada that are specific for health and researchers. So today I'm really delighted to be joined by Sophia and Ricardo. Sophia is a PhD researcher at the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University. She comes with a lot of experience working at this intersection between housing, activism and research, and actually working to create change. And in 2022, she published this really fantastic paper called Make Work Methodology, Canadian Homelessness Research and its Role in Austerity. And we'll be talking a bit about that. Ricardo is a political economist and senior researcher with Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. He's previously managed Toronto's poverty reduction strategy, and he's taught in a variety of different universities. And he brings with it his experience in looking at economic development and participatory democracy in Brazil, his home country. And he wrote and released this book in May 2023 called The Tenant Class that has just really, I think, helped people rethink what we think of and call often the housing crisis and bring that thinking into this, and we'll get into that. So maybe we'll just first start with just a general question, maybe starting with you, Sophia. Tell me a little bit about your work as it relates to housing and what led you to this work, and and just a bit about your background.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for that intro. So as you mentioned, I've been in between these spaces of, I would say, kind of the nonprofit world, research and organizing. And I think that space, being in between those two spaces, is a really important, I would say it's a very important space to learn, to be able to compare what's happening in both of these areas. And I happen to be working at an organization for a number of years doing homelessness research. I think just like a number of folks, I grew to be kind of frustrated with the work after a while. It seems very repetitive. And of course, there's just this clear, obviously, contradiction. I think this is what I was trying to bring attention to in my article at the beginning, is that clearly, we've had a decade or more of so much more research, like a research boom, really, right? So many different institutions doing this work across the country, but we don't see any correlating decrease in homelessness or a housing crisis, right? And yeah, if anything, I mean, it's just getting worse, right? And so I think that's what kind of drove me to this. And then just a bit about my work in general. I'm very much interested in understanding the nonprofit sector specifically. So I will end up probably talking a lot about that, but and being critical of it, like, is this the space for social change is kind of my big question.
That's really helpful. And Ricardo, for you, maybe just a little bit about your background, what led you to write the tenant class?
Mm. So my work starts in political economy and focused on Brazil, where I grew up. And a lot of it was just trying to make sense of how a society grows to have that kind of level of inequality that Brazil had and still has. Eventually, I got to work for the city of Toronto in a much more hands-on role, trying to also deal with growing inequality and growing levels of absolute poverty in Toronto. And then I moved to applied research at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternative, a think tank that it's known for being, very focused on quantitative economic analysis and often referred to as a left-leaning center because we defend public services, we defend unionized workers, and so on and so forth. But it all kind of came together at the beginning of the pandemic, when all of a sudden we were receiving a lot of media requests to intervene on policy debates. A lot of the traditional wonks and that are on television every day argue against public services, against the intervention of government. And at the beginning of the pandemic, where we clearly need a strong government action, they were nowhere to be seen. And then a lot of attention turned to us, who had been saying these things for 40 years. And we're kind of literally, we're like, around the table discussing who's going to do what. And my head went immediately to housing. Something about being in an economic context that resembled a little bit my experience growing up in Brazil, just that level of unemployment, that need for immediate relief, and so on and so forth. Something about my own personal experience, having experienced two renovation as a child, and knowing how much that marked my childhood, and how lived that experience is to this day. I said, I'm going to do housing. I'm going to start looking at tenants, the kinds of saving levels that they have, and the need for some immediate government intervention. So I started writing more on housing, and I got good feedback from friends and colleagues who are on the ground organizing tenants. They identified something different about the way that I wrote that brought more the big picture political economic analysis, and it was less into the weeds of just kind of the housing policy. Eventually, I wrote a 2-pager, and I circulated to movements across the country, and said, if I were to spend more time writing a thicker piece that takes this class analysis perspective, would that be helpful? And their answer was yes. It was a very enthusiastic yes that motivated me to go and write the book. And what I was trying to do was mostly write a resource, something that would be, useful to organizers and to tenants, planning to or wanting to engage in political and direct militant work.
That's really, really helpful. And just thinking about the pandemic as well, I think it did lead a lot of things to get shaken up. Interestingly, I came to this topic around evictions and it actually being asked to be an expert witness in a tribunal where a whole group of people were being evicted from a building. And it was right at the start of the pandemic, and they said, well, we need an expert who's going to talk about why this is bad from a health perspective and also a public health perspective. And of course, it was very easy to explain why evicting people in the midst of an infectious disease outbreak is not a good idea when you're telling people to shelter at home. But what it led me to is also see that we don't have a lot of data in Canada on the rates of evictions. There had been a few reports done, and some journalists had gone through the work of collecting data, but there wasn't really an easy to access repository. So it led the Upstream Lab to use freedom of information requests and bring together data on evictions for Ontario, at least. And it's something that we're now doing for other provinces as well, and trying to make that information available to advocacy groups and other organizers. Maybe to ask another question about what are some of the myths that you see about renters, landlords, and housing affordability that have become so often repeated that they become just part of our general kind of knowledge. Sophia, you maybe starting with you, you mentioned like your experiences with the nonprofit housing space and also with housing research, but what are some of the myths that you see that we need to dispel?
Yeah, I mean, of course, number one myth is that the market is the solution here. I think even right now in Toronto, I'm pretty sure this is Toronto, we're seeing, condos are not being bought. There's like a huge glut actually of condos. So it's like very clear evidence. We don't even need research for that one. It's right there. There's not building more isn't solving this. We don't have a supply issue. We have a distribution issue. And connecting that to my work on nonprofit stuff, and this is kind of maybe a slightly more unpopular kind of take, because nonprofit housing does, I would say, save lives right now, right? I'm interested in questioning whether that's really should that be our solution, because it's also a private solution. This sector is filling in the gaps behind, all these cuts over the years, right? This isn't a public system. That's why it's called community housing. That's why it's called affordable housing. It's not called social housing. It's not called public. There's a reason for that, right? So I would say that's a huge myth there. Critical of the nonprofit stuff. Of course, we need to keep fighting for anything we can get. But do we really need to, do we want to be, is that the direction is my question. And then in general, I would say the other myth is, and I see this perpetuated in this system, that I would say the nonprofit system that is charged with managing the social fallout of this economic situation that we're in, right? They have to manage people's lives now. There's this myth that, I think they actually do accept that there is housing scarcity. And so just kind of inherently right there, that idea, I think, is also going to shift how you're going to do the work or how you're going to do your research, right? And they also accept that displacement is also inevitable. I think we saw that is very much so throughout the pandemic and the kind of the mass evictions that happened. I saw research. I was contacted by a group of researchers, I think in Quebec, for example, who were after the fact asking, they wanted to see what worked after people got evicted. They weren't really asking, maybe what kept people in their homes, because there were actually a lot of people who got to stay and weren't displaced. So that myth and that tenants need advocates, of course. We've seen a lot of evidence, and actually Ricardo's book does a really good job of this, is showing how people all over the country and historically have been able to fight displacement and stay put or just improve the conditions of their homes.
So that's really helpful. It's like myths about the solutions, myths about kind of the role of different groups in this ecosystem, and also that acceptance of displacement, that it's inevitable that people are going to be displaced, and they just have to accept that, and all of that overarching with kind of the market as a solution. Maybe Ricardo, turning to you, of course, the tenant class begins with, calling out a big myth, about housing.
Yes, my controversial argument is that there is no housing crisis, based on the notion that crisis would be something that is unexpected, that it impacts everyone negatively, and that brings everyone around the table with a genuine intention of solving the problem at hand. And I don't think any of these things apply to housing. We have a housing system that has been set up in a particular way. It's been functioning the same way for decades and decades. We see this crisis ever so often. There's a number of actors in this entire system that benefit tremendously from the way things are set up. And there's not everyone that's interested in solving this, because it's not a problem for a lot of people. A lot of people are making a lot of money out of this, and they're not only not interested in changing, but they are actively engaged in lobbying and in political work to preserve things the way they are. So I have really an issue with calling it a crisis, because it mischaracterizes the situation and it's not only an inaccurate characterization of the problem, but it's one that prevents us from having serious conversations about who's winning, who's losing, and who is perpetuating the situation that we have. But another and sort of related myth that the book goes after has this notion that we need is a technical solution to the problem. So, as a consequence, in part as a consequence of calling it a crisis, the notion is then, let's get all the polished wonks around the table, and we're going to look very serious, and we're going to think about this really hard, and we're going to come up with a win-win policy solution that will make life better for everyone. And we see that all the time. We see that all the time. Like just this last week, there was a long piece on the Toronto Star that, on one hand, has really good investigative journalism in there, looking at all the different facets of housing policy over time at the different levels of government, and you say, well, some serious research work went into this. But at the same time, the entire article doesn't have a single subject. There's no politics. There's no class interest. There's no class struggle. It just happens. It's just this thing that happens by itself. Policy was approved, policy was rejected, policy was discussed. There's not a single subject in the entire article. Executing an action, which is the real world. So I think, bring agency back into the conversation. It's extremely important, and on both sides. There's agency on the sides those who are perpetuating the system the way it is, but there's also a lot of agency, as Sophia was talking just now. There's also a lot of agency on the side of those who are resisting things and who are proposing alternatives.
This, and we're going to get into specifically around tenant organizing and what the history has been and what that looks like today. But it's so incredible how often we see this with many different issues, from accessing healthcare services to the climate change crisis. It's like these conversations are sanitized from just naming who is benefiting from this current system, and that these challenges they're not independent of the politics, and of, as you've noted, kind of also things like the struggle between different classes or different groups of people in an area. Maybe we could talk a bit about tenant organizing, and that as, and maybe I'll turn to you, Ricardo, first. You talk about the history of this and where it is today. Maybe you could just paint a picture of that, and also why this is such a central part to this issue.
Yes, I find it extremely important to talk about the history of working class people in Canada, the history of popular movements, the history of resistance, and struggle against our dominant and economic elites. And throughout our history, unfortunately, I think our kids get a quite sanitized and boring, if I may, version of history at school, right? Where one dude had this great idea and then was succeeded by this other dude, and everything happened in Ottawa in some sort of chateau, and they all had debates thinking about the future of the country, and then these things got implemented, and salute, and it's quite like, it's quite first, it's inaccurate, and most importantly, it's inaccurate, but it also prevents us from recognizing the importance of organizing on different fronts in different ways and across the country, and whatever organizing looks like, for the different groups. So the book does a little bit that, tries to bring that history a little bit, looking at tenant organizing from since Confederation, and not only in big cities like Toronto, but in much smaller places across the country, there has always been this fundamentally antagonistic relationship between landlords who want to take as much income from working families as possible, and tenants who say, no, simply say, no, you can't do this, and push back and organize all forms of collective action in order to preserve their livelihoods and not allow someone to walk away with the earnings. And then so bring to this day, we see that too, although that gets a lot less coverage in the media. We talk a lot about housing, but whenever the story includes tenants, more often than not, is an individual tenant doing something on their own, right? So this story, it starts with meet Mary. Mary is a tenant, and it tells a little bit of the story about Mary, and tells the story about this individual landlord, and there was some disagreement between them, and then Mary got to push back a little bit, and the landlord decided to go a little bit, and then some sort of solution came at the end, but always presented as a private matter between two individuals, right? And I think it's a mischaracterization of the fact that there was organized tenants, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, there are large corporates and business interests, a lot of it connected with political interests too, and the two groups are constantly struggling as groups with fundamentally opposing interests. And I think that's the story that we need to tell. So nowadays there's a lot of this happening across Canada, and there's different models, and the book sort of presents a little bit these different models. I'm not a tenant organizer, and I don't pretend to be. So my role was just sort of to present what different groups have decided to do in response to their local realities and through their own internally democratic processes. So there's a few options there for groups that focus very on one specific territory and try to build as much power within that territory, and try to do it without the support of any other organization that would, in their perspective, most likely kind of become a distraction and kind of derail the focus of the fight. And other groups who instead create as many alliances as possible, try to bring more resources and more connections, and kind of deal with the issue of perhaps being kind of, pulled in different directions at different times. Groups that I'll try to organize provincially. In Quebec, we have some groups that try to organize at the city level, like Vancouver's trying to do. There are different models, but there's a lot of happening, and that doesn't get enough attention. So that's kind of part of the goal of the book, and then my work more broadly.
That's great. Sophia, you mentioned a bit about your experiences, and I also want to bring it to your article that you wrote about, which kind of starts with this example of people organizing and then kind of being punished for it at a housing conference, and the kind of irony and kind of sad reality of that. But Maybe you could talk a bit about your perspective on this, on organizing and the role of community organizing, and then also this relationship with research and academic spaces.
Yeah, so that story, this is in 2014. It was the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, I guess, annual conference. This one was in Vancouver, and there happened to be this protest. It's pouring rain. There's people outside, and there's all these fancy people inside, managers and whatnot, and they're inside solving homelessness. And there's unhoused people and supporters outside. And their demand was to end the ending homelessness industry, which I think is great. And yeah, so my article tries to really take that really seriously. And I guess I can go back to my experience in and really during like the height of the pandemic, these mass evictions going on. And when I'm in these two different spaces, I see this kind of research on the one hand, like I don't know, I'm researching how much it sucks to leave the child welfare system in Ontario, for example, and how, you know, whatever the numbers of, you know, how many youth end up on the street, for example. Right. Very kind of descriptive, let's say, very individualistic, of course. And on the other hand, I'm actually seeing organizers finding the time, because they're, I mean, I would say they're really busy, but we found the time to do research on, I mean, who we're up against. You mentioned like I think you mentioned the landlord and tenant system, at least in Ontario, is what we were dealing with. And we set up an entire website kind of showcasing who are we talking, like, who is this? Who is actually benefiting from this situation? We're naming them. We're naming Capri, or naming Smart Living, or naming Hazelview. We're actually even naming the Toronto Community Housing Corporation. So like, and we've got their faces there. Who are these adjudicators in the landlord and tenant board? We're discovering that it's completely, of course, biased towards landlords, that whole quasi-judicial system. So just that contrast in the work that's happening there. And one is clearly also helping us, you know, figure out these important intervention kind of points, let's say. There's a real reason why we're doing it. And the other work, I would say, that's kind of more digging into who's benefiting, who has the power here. And then other work, like I think Renovictions is one example. In Toronto, it started as actually just like a database of tenants in Toronto that are being renovicted, and the people behind that realized, well, this is kind of boring. I mean, we got all these numbers now and all these addresses, and they actually just started to connect people. They realized that people had the same landlords, for example, or they're in the same neighborhood. And so it became more action oriented. So definitely I'm very much inspired by that kind of work. Yeah, and I just think, yeah, the contrast was too real for me. I had to write this article.
Yeah, it's I think a lot of people you know, listening to this who are in academic spaces or research will resonate, this disconnect or dissonance between what you see the work doing, the day-to-day kind of describing a problem, often very, very kind of sanitized of any discussion of political power or who's benefiting, and then just seeing the reality and actually what is needed. It gets at this very fundamental question, which is truly what changes policy, like what forces change to happen. And like Ricardo mentioned, we often are taught this very much like it's a single leader who had an idea. The classic example in Canada is Medicare and Tommy Douglas, and that it was this single, you know, really hardworking kind of leader who just kind of thought of Medicare, and that's suddenly, we have Medicare. And of course, that's not the reality. There, even in more recent discussions with colleagues about movement building around Medicare in general, and the fact that so many people don't have access to care, the system's getting worse. The system is very much facing all sorts of challenges, and as a result of a lot of lack of resources and many other decisions that were made. But the solution for people in academic spaces and researchers is often we need to do more research, and so I wonder if you could each talk about how do we kind of turn away from that idea of just more descriptive work, and what do you see as, if we think about housing, what is, if at all, the role of research? Because of course, all three of us do research in different areas or draw on it. But what do you see as the role of academics and researchers? And maybe starting with you, Ricardo, you mentioned earlier when we were getting ready that you often meet with, say, graduate students or others to give them kind of a landscape of what is actually out there. But maybe, starting with you, what do you see as the role of researchers, and what advice would you give to people?
And it is really hard for folks like ourselves to admit the fact that knowledge is not the missing link, that it is not what preventing action, it's not what preventing the implementation of policies that could lead to better outcomes. We can talk about housing, we can talk about the climate crisis. There are many examples where we have an overwhelming amount of evidence pointing to the fact that the way we're doing things is not working for a lot of people. We have an overwhelming number of policy options that have been developed and sometimes quite sophisticated and ready to go, and yet they don't get implemented. And a lot of folks like us and the progressive camp more broadly have this reaction like, oh, only if we show, this one more link, only if we show this one more piece, then what? That's usually my question. Then what? So what for me is missing is the power analysis, is the understanding that people who have the authority and are in the power, in the position to decide whether or not it will get implemented, what is preventing them from acting on it is not A, lack of knowledge, B, lack of interest or compassion. It's much more structured than this, is that they're in a position where they're defending some class interests, and it's their job to not move on that file, right? So on the housing file specifically, what I tend to emphasize is that there are a number of people in our political establishment whose job description is to preserve the status quo. While looking busy, while looking interested, while giving the impression of being engaged with the civil society and discussing alternatives, but ultimately their job description is to preserve the status quo. There's a lot of resource and time and power invested in keeping the housing system exactly the way it is. So I think that I think it's important. I think Canadian civil society, in the way it has, certain aspects of Canadian civil society, especially the sort of professionalized, 9 to 4 civil society, or often we call the third sector, functions on the assumption that either more knowledge or just kind of convincing this one actor of doing the right thing will get us there. So there's a lot of emphasis that go then into engaging with those actors and providing them the knowledge necessary. The alternative is to acknowledge that they're part of a class, they're doing their job in defending their class interests and preserving things the way they are. What we need to do is to look at our own class interests and our own forms of organizing. And instead of spending this absurd amount of money and time and energy trying to convince them, we need to channel that to strengthening this side, so that we find ourselves in positions of power where we get to call the shots and implementing the decisions, or at least in positions of creating enough of a political crisis that will force the hand of those in powers. But, you know, knowledge is not the missing link, and asking them nicely won't do either.
Yeah, I see this so often in where the idea is it's about having a closed door meeting with some policymaker, and that's going to be the key goal. And there's often so much of energy, like you mentioned, goes into that, into preparing, into cultivating relationships with people and getting into that. And yeah, it's so often that's absolutely not going to be the thing. I also think part of this is, and I'm speaking as someone who's a member of that kind of group of people who has a lot of privilege and often is involved in the system of producing science, is there's also often an aversion to disruption. Like there's something that when you raise the idea, like in coming back to tenants, of tenants doing a rent strike or organizing a protest or being more disruptive, there's something almost psychological that members of a group who are privileged and kind of you described in the professional kind of class, they react really strongly to that. I wonder if it's because of a lack of exposure. Is it because they almost see themselves in the policymaker who's getting disturbed in some way? There is an example from healthcare where the then conservative government made dramatic cuts to healthcare for refugee claimants, and it was just like a sudden kind of cutting off of healthcare, and it elicited a lot of strong reactions amongst health providers who were providing care, and suddenly this was like no more. And so it led to a campaign of actually interrupting ministers when they were doing announcements, whatever the topic was, to draw attention to this. But it was quite interesting to see that idea of just interrupting someone speaking was seen as so violent, almost so like it was just so out of the norm that there was strong reactions to it. But Sophia, what's your thoughts about this, and you know how so much in the research and area they act to reinforce this system, you know, that we see?
I mean, we're clearly caught in a cycle. It's very much tied to funding. That funding is also not unrelated to who is benefiting from the so-called housing crisis either, or at least if they're not the same guys, which can happen, they're part of the same group, same class, right? Same interests. So we're going to constantly, I mean, I think the reason we're seeing, the same questions being asked and the same answers, being produced, is to do with this this kind of cyclical kind of system. And really, it's just perpetuating this kind of little competitive management industry. Really, it's competitive. It's because it's private for the most part. This is not a public system anymore, right? So we have to we're competing. We need to show that we've got the information that shows that we're doing a really good job. We're doing more with less is usually the case, or there's this significant need. So that's the kind of work that you're going to end up seeing the most is successful programs, because I'm sure we know of a lot of successful programs, right? Everybody has a great time meeting whatever their worker, and something happens, and it's some individual, of course, usually story as well, always thrown in there. or this need, which is really also easy to get. We can see the need. So yeah, getting caught up in that cycle. And again, yes, like very this is very individualized kind of research or knowledge production. And I think Ricardo was kind of touching on this, but just actually shifting towards more structural analysis generally. What are these systems? Who is involved? The relationships. It's really about relationships, right? This is a social problem. This isn't a bunch of individuals. So doing that kind of work, and I like that you also mentioned just like this kind of disruption and stuff. So in my article, I mentioned something called unruly research, and I think there's a lot more that can happen with this conversation because I had a lot of questions about it after. But in the article, I kind of briefly say that, we need more. Unruly research could be structural analysis with like combined with like a militant kind of aspect where you just start flipping things. You start, instead of looking down, because that's how we're oriented right now, we're looking downward toward let's say homelessness and counting how many people are on the street instead of looking up. And it's really just about reorienting. I think I've already mentioned before too, like naming who is it, who is really benefiting here is going to change a lot. You have definitely a culture here to be really polite.
Yes.
Absolutely way too polite about that. These are our lives,
Yeah.
They can be actually shortened because of this.
Yeah. Ricardo.
And I think that on the being polite piece of it, I think there are two pieces of it that are very important to talk about in with regards to this professional civil society, of which I'm part of as well, right? So I think one, and Sophia talked about this, is about the metrics. What is the metrics in the end of the month, in the end of the year, that you count as success? And being in that closed door meetings is like a big check mark. Submitting, papers for government consultations, check mark. So these are all the check marks. Being in these official spaces, being participating in government organized consultations, having access to politicians and talking to each other, even in these conferences and workshops, like the 2014 conference that Sophia was talking about. These are all big check marks. They're in the metrics of these organizations. And that's what they use to secure their funding. That's what they use even to themselves to have a sense of like that they're doing their work. So that would have to change. And I can provide a very concrete example. The other day I was talking to colleagues who were preparing a submission to the poverty reduction strategy of the Ontario government. I was like, this is a government that canceled the minimum wage as soon as they came in. And then they proceeded to freeze social assistance rates. And then as soon as they got around it, they canceled rent controls. This is like their first 3 months of work. And now you're spending resources on preparing a submission to the poverty reduction strategy. How many hours of work will go into this? What if your organization put all those hours in finding a way to directly support the more than 600 tenants on a rent strike now in Toronto? Like, what would it look like very concretely to do that shift, right? And so that is a kind of the institutional level. At the individual level, something that I've seen that I find extremely disconcerting too, is that there is a pressure for the sort of more young and militant and often more diverse folks to acclimatize to a more polite conversation. So I've been in rooms where there's a broad range of folks, and there's a sort of symbolic capital exerted from the part of the more senior folks in the room, where experience has a lot of weight and where the tone is one of being pragmatic and working, understanding the policies, the art of the possible, sentences like this, right? And the whole ambience is created so that anyone who comes and says the emperor has no clothing is judged as not having enough knowledge, not having enough experience, being a bit naive, definitely not seasoned enough to be, in this group. And that, prevents those voices from participating. And usually those are the most interesting things that people have to say. And sometimes I have to follow up with folks in individual chats and individual calls. It's like, I want to hear more. What do you have to say? I saw that you were cut off, but so it happens at also the individual professional level where your acceptance among your essential peers depends on you kind of toning down a little bit. Otherwise, you seem kind of like a naive radical that doesn't understand this work. So those two things are really, really important to sort of address if we want a civil society. Again, we're only talking about that professional civil society. All the other stuff's happening here with real social movements, right? Mm-hmm. We're talking about what's happening in this space here.
Yeah, no, that's really powerful. And it's the metrics of these institutions and also that whole dampening down. And I've also seen that many, many times as well. I know that we're coming to the end of our time, and I just wanted to give you each a moment for any other thoughts that you have on this topic of actually, changing the way that we think and frame issues, and also thinking about our roles, which are often in academic spaces. But maybe starting with you, Sophia, any final thoughts that come to mind?
Sure. Yeah, I think, really, I would just love to see a mass reorientation in our knowledge production, in the questions that we're asking. I think it's very methodological, and paying specific attention to this very austere environment that we're in right now, as a key kind of background piece to all of this. And really just, and this is, I guess, more on my own work, but again, being critical of, we're working mostly within very private spaces, privatizing, especially the healthcare system. I'm sure you're seeing that left, right, and center, and paying attention to that as well as how we're getting kind of caught up in that process, and think about how we can maybe unravel that. And at the end of the day, just really recognizing the working class, the tenants, as the primary agents in resistance in this political and social struggle. I think key is just really exposing that and bringing those stories out. At the very least, we need to be hearing about it, because when there's many tenants who, they don't see this. We don't, as mentioned, we hear about Mary, the one individual tenant. We're not hearing about 200, I think about 200 folks in Weston right now on rent strike. There's Lawrence Heights as well, just as many. This is not coming up.
Yeah.
So, exposing those and bringing those stories to light will also encourage others to do the same.
I think that, and just before going to Ricardo, I think on that point of the working class and the people affected, it makes me think a lot about also what we've seen in Canada around harm reduction and around who was really pushing for this and who was really leading these movements as well. Ricardo, any final thoughts?
I always invite folks to rethink the question of neutrality. I am of the view that there's no such a thing as a neutral position, and folks who enter the public policy space assuming that the neutral position is the more sophisticated one because you consider both sides and you find a place in the center where it can be very impartial. That is not true. That is just a safe space. It's not the most interesting space from any perspective. from an analytical perspective, it's usually not the most interesting. From an empirical perspective, not the most interesting. And definitely from the political perspective, you are inadvertently, in most cases, just supporting the status quo. So I encourage folks to find ways to be very clear on their stance on these issues. And I guarantee you, it is possible to be clear on your stance and to be strong on your intervention, to have sophisticated interventions that take a clear stance. It is possible. It is more helpful, and it's also more fun to do. So I just encourage what that mean. Encourage folks to think about how to do that on their own work.
Well, that's great, and a great note to end on. Thank you both, Sophia and Ricardo, for this conversation and for all the work that you're doing. It's really excellent and inspiring. And yeah, look forward to the chance to work together on these issues.